Hello everyone, my name is Ahmed Bakir. I'm the author of Program the Internet of Things with Swift and Beginning iOS Media App Development. Today I'm going to show you how to build your first app using Xcode 8, Swift 3, and iOS 10. Cool. So the first thing we need to do is install Xcode. The best way to install Xcode is using the Mac App Store. So go to the official App Store app on your computer, search for Xcode, and then download the official version from Apple. So right here, Developer Tools, Apple website. So you want to make sure that you're always getting Xcode from the App Store. Last year there was a big issue in Asia where people were downloading a malicious version of Xcode. The icon looked the same, the website looked similar to the official Apple website, but it wasn't. And then they were submitting apps that I believe may have had spyware built into them or some other hacks, some other vulnerabilities. These apps were pulled, but to save yourself the trouble, just use the App Store to download. You'll be getting the official build, but you'll also be getting the latest updates, which as you start to submit your apps to the App Store, the iOS App Store, for general distribution, if you're not compliant with a valid version of Xcode, usually the latest one or the one right before that, you won't even be able to submit. So once you found it, just click install, and then depending on how fast your internet connection is, it'll take some time to download and install. It may also upgrade if you have an old version. Cool. So that's all we need to do for installation. Then once you've downloaded and installed Xcode, the first time you open it, you get this screen. This is basically a shortcut screen. This right pane will list previous projects you've worked on. This left pane gives you 3 options. Get started with a playground, create a new Xcode project, and check out an existing project. Playgrounds are a way of kind of live previewing the results of your code as you're working on it. For instance, if you're adding, or rather if you're making a function that generates like Fibonacci numbers and you want to make sure your calculation is correct, you can modify the line of code on the left and see what the result will be on the right. It's very cool. I'll probably go over it in another video. What we're going to focus on today is option 2, creating a new Xcode project. This is where we basically create our development environment, add code, add our UI, hook things up. The third option, check out an existing project. This is what you'll use if you're going to pull something from Git or Subversion, where there's a repository stored online somewhere and you want to pull it into your computer. So we want option 2. Let's click on it. Let's see what it does. Alright, so after you click on create a new project, it brings up this template picker. It gives us a lot of options. The first at the top, we pick our platform. So do we want our app to run on iOS, watchOS, tvOS, macOS, cross-platform? We're developing an iOS app, so we'll pick iOS. Next, it'll give you templates for what kind of app you want to build. Single view, game, master, detail, and then at the bottom, frameworks, libraries. When you get into advanced development, you'll start using framework library. For most people, single view, page, or tabbed application is the best starting point. They kind of build that UI you see in the icon. So like a tabbed application is something like iTunes, where there's buttons at the bottom, like a featured, list of all songs you own. And a page-based application is something like iBooks, where you swipe left and right between different pages. To keep things simple, we're going to use single view application. It's just a single screen with something on it. Okay. Once you've done that, it asks you to name your product, pick your team, name your organization, pick your language, and what devices. So this is what shows up when you're debugging the app and when you install it on your phone or in the simulator. So product name. So I'm going to name it My First App. Team. We don't need to select this yet because we're not distributing it, but this is where you tie the project to your Apple developer connection credentials. So like usually that's the developer account for your company or for yourself. We'll just leave it at team for now. Organization name, that's your company name, or it could be your name. I'll just use my company's name. This is probably the most important selection. Language, Swift or Objective-C. This is basically how the template is generated. Like it'll create a new project and it'll change the build flags and some other configurations depending on whether Swift or Objective-C is your primary language. Since the title is your first app with Xcode 8, Swift 3, and iOS 10, I'll leave it in Swift. Device is universal. This lets you pick what UIs your app will run on. Universal means it'll run on everything. You could also narrow it down to just iPhone or iPad. I'll keep it at universal. One of the caveats here is that if you submit an app to the App Store the first time with universal, you're going to have iPhone and iPad support built in. You can never remove one of the two. So if you're building an iPhone only app and then later want to put in iPad support, you should probably switch it to iPhone for the first version you support. Okay. Then there are these other options: core data, unit tests, UI tests. Core data is Apple's database abstraction level, or rather layer. We're not going to use it. We're just building a very simple app to start with. Including unit tests, including UI tests. These are when you start testing your app, like when your app gets to the point of complexity where you need to see what code changes might be breaking it, where you're writing code to test your code, you'll add these. We don't need them right now, so I'll disable them. Cool. Then you press next, and it'll ask you where to save it. So I'm going to save it in a folder called testing, rather My First App. It gives you this option, create Git repository. This is if you want to create a local Git repo for your project. Like if you're used to using Git and you want to roll back your changes. I'm not going to use it right now because later on if I want to commit this to a real Git repository, it could cause conflicts. Rather, it'll actually make it more complex than it needs to be. So I'll disable it. Then I'll hit create. Cool. So this is our sample project. Okay, it doesn't look like much. It's just really a white screen. So how do we view what the app looks like? The UI for a project in Xcode is managed through Interface Builder. Interface Builder is kind of their drag and drop tool for putting together pieces and then connecting those pieces to your code. The files Interface Builder works off of our storyboard and CIB, or rather XIB, nib files. If we look on the left is called the Project Navigator. If we look here, we have two storyboard files. So remember what I said, Interface Builder, storyboards? So our UI is in a storyboard. So let's click it and see what happens. Interface Builder loads through Xcode. You don't need to install a separate app. It's just kind of what they call that mode of Xcode. So we see a white screen with an arrow. This is the first screen of our app. So this is our UI. Okay. Where's our code? Okay. We're writing a Swift project. So you know how like in C and C++, your source code files are like .c or .cpp or Java's .java? In Swift, your source code is in .swift files. We have two, appdelegate.swift and viewcontroller.swift. When you click on the file in the Project Navigator, it shows you the contents. So if we look at appdelegate, it has a lot of pre-filled in code. and most of it says application will, application did. The app delegate is basically the entry point for your application. Like, it's the first piece of code that gets hit when your app runs, and it's also the last piece of code. What I mean by that is whenever your app launches or closes or backgrounds, it'll call a method from app delegate, then go to where it needs to go. So whenever you open the app for the very first time, it calls application did finish launching with options. And when you quit the app, it calls application will terminate. Now, I bring this up, it's the first and last place where any of your code runs, because app delegate's really where you're supposed to do your setup and cleanup. Like, if you have any global variables or any libraries, like a logging library or like Twitter, something where you need to like initialize a key or something else to use it later on in the app, you'll put it in app delegate. Or if you want to do something like stop music when you close the app, like perhaps when you use this will enter or did enter background, you'll put code there in the app delegate. But other than that, you're not really going to use the app delegate day to day. Most of your heavy lifting is going to be in a view controller or another class that you write and manage yourself. So our sample project has two files, the app delegate and the view controller, but the one we're really going to work with is the view controller. So we click on that. It's very empty. It has two stubs with two functions that are started but don't have anything in them, called did load and did receive memory warning. A stub is just a general term we use in computer science for an unimplemented function. It's like when you get a compiler warning and it says you need to implement this method, and so you just make a function that doesn't do anything. That's a stub. So we have two stubs, did load, did receive memory warning. The one we're really interested in is did load. That's, if we look at the comment, where we do any additional setup after loading the view, typically from a nib. So this is what's going to happen when our nib, basically our storyboard, loads. Nib is the old term where it was a storyboard is kind of like a storyboard, a visual storyboard, or like a storyboard for a movie where you can go from scenes from one screen to the other using these arrows. But before they had storyboards, you would be working scene by scene, and each scene was stored as its own nib, its own zib file. When we have a storyboard, it's basically one file that has all of our scenes on it, or that has selected scenes on it. So the function we're most interested in is view did load. That's what's going to happen after our storyboard loads. Okay, so that's our sample app. It's a white screen that does nothing. Okay. So what I like to do when I'm programming is I want to think, like I like to do a little sanity test to myself, like, does this sample app run for the first time? Or I made this change, does this change reflect on the app? So that's the process I'm going to be using in this video, and that's the process I use when I'm developing. So let's do the first sanity step. Does the app run at all? So we need to run the app. Okay, how do we run an app in XCode? So if you go up here, you'll see this segmented bar. The first item is my first app. The second is iPhone 7 Plus. So this is the name of the target, rather the app you're building. For us, we just created one app. It's called My First App. It doesn't have any special configurations. It's just a configuration to build and run our app. The next, this is kind of the device target. So this is what device you're running on. iPhone 7 Plus, these are all simulators. So Apple, along with XCode and Interface Builder, when you download XCode, it gives you simulators, programs that are able to run like development versions of your app. And so they build in all these discrete simulators for you. iPad Air, iPad Air 2, iPad Pro, 13, 6, 6 Plus. You can select one of them and it'll run it on your computer. Up here, we also have build only device, generic iOS device, and this general device option. Build only device is what you use when you're about to do distribution and you don't have a phone plugged in. So like if you're going to build your app to release on the App Store or test flight. And then this top one, no devices connected. Something special happens there when you plug in an iPhone or an iPad, and I'll show you right now. Okay, so I'm plugging in my iPhone, and then let's see what happens. It's showing no devices connected, but if we give it a second, it'll find my iPad. There we go. Okay, Ahmed's iPhone. OS version lower than deployment target. So what this means is it'll say it found my iPad and it lets me build on it. But if I want the app to run, I need to make some settings. So I use this iPhone for testing and I leave it on iOS 9 so that I have an iOS 9 device. My iPad's an iOS 10. But it's finding it, and then it says, yeah, OS version lower than deployment target. So if I change one of my build settings, then I can run it. When you plug in an iOS 10 device, it'll run well the first time, and you won't have this error message. So, doesn't like my iPhone, let's use the simulator. So let's switch. The way you switch targets, rather device targets, is just select a different item in the bar. So I'm going to go down and select the iPhone 7 Plus simulator. Then to run it, there are two ways. The first, you hit the play button, it'll build, then run. So let's see what happens. It'll say building my first app, linking. Then when it's done, the simulator will pop up. It could take a second, it could take a minute, depending on how fast or slow your Mac is. I don't know if you can hear it, but my fans are firing up on my MacBook Pro. It's a bit processor intensive. And the simulator comes up in the background, and when it's ready, it'll start loading. So right now it's putting up the simulator. There's nothing to worry about. The first time you run a simulator, like if you've installed XCode for the first time, or if you're installing a new app on it for the first time, it may be a bit slow. But subsequent times you run it, it's going to be faster. So it's taking a minute. While it does that, I'll show you other ways to load running. Okay, well, now it works. So now the simulator is running our app. You'll see there's debug information, and then just like the UI, there's a white screen. Okay, so the template app works. If I want to stop it, you just hit this stop button. Just like a Walkman. Play and stop. Cool. So, that's using the UI. If you want to use the menus, if you click on Product, we have Run, Test, Profile, Analyze. So you can hit the Run button. If you're just, and that'll do the same thing, it'll build and run the app. So yeah, exact same thing. And then like I said, it's usually faster the second time. And then there it is. There goes your app. If you just want to build, like if you just want to make sure your code compiles, just hit build. And you can use the shortcuts. It'll show you right here. Command R, Command B. Those will build or run your app. Okay, so let's make our first app do something. So let's first show something on the screen. To add items to your UI, you use the Object Navigator and Interface Builder. So this guy on the left was the Project Navigator. This is kind of our scratchpad where we're going to be working on our UI. And then over here we have, it's kind of an auxiliary pane, but it has different inspectors based on what kind of file you're working on. And at the bottom we have our object library. So these are pre-built links to UI elements, or even like types of code templates that Apple provides you. The one we want is really the object library for the UI. It's this third button. And so we're going to show something on the screen. The first thing we'll show is a label. So you can scroll down and find a label, or you can search for it. I like to search, and then you'll take it from the object library and you'll drag and drop onto your screen. Then you see there are guidelines. It'll kind of help you navigate where you're placing it, like if you're putting it at the center of the screen. And then you can do like what I'm doing. You can change its size, make it taller, wider, so on and so forth. Okay. So that's a label. So I'm going to save because I'm one of those people that instinctively saves everything. And then I'm going to run again. And let's see what happened. Okay. Sometimes it's slow. So let's wait for it to stop. And so if you want to kill something, you just click on this, you can hold down on the stop button and then kill it. Or in this case, the simulator app. And it may give you an error like this one. So let's run it again and see if it actually shows label on there. Loading the simulator. The fans are revving up. Then eventually they'll load. So while it loads, let me show you some other cool things about Interface Builder. Okay. So remember, this is our Project Navigator object library. This guy right here, this is your view hierarchy. So when you add something to it, like when you add a label to the view controller, it'll show you where it's placed relative to something else. So here, this shows me that the label was added on top of our view in the view controller. This is good for debugging because sometimes you'll hide items, like a box might be on top of another box and you won't know where to find it. You can go to the view hierarchy. Down here, view as. This lets you select how you preview your app. Like when you're doing your UI development, remember we selected a universal app. This will actually make the preview change based on the size and orientation. So by default it gives us iPhone 6s. I'm building and running on an iPhone 7 Plus. So let's click this 6s Plus. It's the same screen dimensions as 7 Plus, but you'll see it's a bit bigger. So this is our 6s Plus. This is our 6, and then let's just be dramatic. Let's go to the 4s. You'll see it changes the size of the preview to match the phone. Okay, so let's go back to 6s Plus because that's what we're running on, and let's see if our simulator is ready. Okay. And it's ready, and you see that our label shows up just what we wanted it to in that position. Okay, cool. One last thing, we can also change the orientation. So we can do this landscape, and then it'll change that. Now note, these are all previews. You're going to be laying code out, or rather you're going to be laying elements out and debugging against this, but it's all going to be calculated at runtime. So don't expect things to work exactly as you lay them out each and every time. You're going to have to use auto layout for that. I'll show you in a future video, but this is just a start. You'll be using this to preview. Cool. Alright, so we have a label. Okay. And it looks kind of ugly. The text is small. It's not fully centered. So how do we modify it? So go up here and go to the Attributes Inspector. This is the 4th button. I always forget what these are called. It's kind of hidden. And then this lets you change, like I said, it lets you view and change the properties for the label. So luckily these work a lot like most other UI-based applications. You know, like Microsoft Word or Pages. You can change the font by tapping up or down. You can click on the text button and it'll actually let you change the font entirely. So Apple likes you to use their system font, But you can use some built-in fonts from your computer using custom, like Optima. And then if everything loads correctly, if it's a font that Apple recognizes out of the box, you can use that in your app. So I'll change it to Optima, and I've increased the size. You can also click on color. That'll let you change the font color. So let's change it to blue. My favorite color is blue. And then if we want to center the text, you can use alignment. So let's align it in the center. Okay. So now we have a label that's centered. To change the text, there are two ways. You can double click in here, say this is a label, and then click return, and it'll save your changes. You could also do it in here. This is a label. And then you can click tab or return, and then it'll save there. Okay. So I'm instinctively pressing save, and then I'll try to run it again. And when I run it now, it should show this is a label, and it should be blue, and it should be more centered. Okay, so that's a start. So we have a blue label in the center of the screen. Cool. What I want to do with this app is I want to make a button that changes what's in the label. That way you can kind of see how code interacts with the UI. So let's do that. The element I want is a button. So I can search down and find it. And like it says here, it intercepts touch events and sends an action message to a target object when it's tapped. So let's add a button. Same thing, drag and drop, and then resize. I don't like Apple's default style. This is one of those development philosophical things. It's just a colored piece of text on a clear background. So when I make a button, what I like to do is I'll change the background color, change the text color, so it looks kind of like a button in other applications. So I'm gonna change the text color, well, to white. A lot of times people will have a white text on a colored background, and the text disappears, but to get it back, I'll change the background color. So to change the background, I scroll down. This background is background image. What I want is the background for the view. This gives me a plain color, and then I'll use blue. I'll make the background color the same blue. Then there you go. We have a button that looks more like a button. It looks different from our text label. And I'm going to change the name. I'm going to change the text that appears to click me. So now we have a button. And then let's run the app and see if it lays out. And then, yep, we have a button. Doesn't do anything except highlight, and we have our label. So now we're going to learn how to make them do stuff. Okay. Cool. So you can visually lay out stuff in Interface Builder, but until it's hooked up to code, it's not really going to change based on user events or user interaction, or it's not actually really going to do anything. So to make it change, we need to add the label, the button, whatever else we're adding to our class. So if we look here, we want to figure out what class manages the screen. A class in iOS development it's kind of like an add-on. It's kind of like the unit where everything's contained in there. If you're familiar with other programming languages, it's our object. You know, it's the instantiation of what defines what a screen is going to be. So the class or view controller is what defines what's on the view controller, what happens when you interact with it. Okay, so that's what our view controller Swift file is. It's a class view controller, and it inherits from UI view controller. Okay, so how do we figure out where the two are connected? This is important because when you start adding more view controller files, when you start adding more classes to your program, you're going to need to connect them to each other. So To figure out where something on your storyboard is connected to something in your code, click on the top. Just click on that view controller. You can click on it here in the center pane, or you can click on it in the view hierarchy, and then go to the identity inspector, this third button. Click here, it'll show you the class. So this is a drop down of everything that's available. And the class you want to use is something that exists in here. So something that exists in this right pane and matches up. So the class we're going to use is view controller. If we click on this arrow, it'll actually jump to that code. So this means when we write our application, all the code for it, like all the properties, all the code that changes how things are going to happen, is going to be in this view controller class. Okay. So let's hop back again. So we want to tie the button and the label to our view controller. How do we do that? We add them to the class. So first we'll make a button called my button. It'll be a var, a variable. Then we'll make a label, my label. Okay. When you want to see if things are added in XCode correctly, a quick way to do that in Interface Builder is you'll hop over to the Connections Inspector, and you'll see if they show up in here. They don't, meaning we didn't do something correctly. When we hook it up correctly, we'll see my button and my label in here. And we can actually build a connection, like we can drag and drop from here to these. So it's not showing up correctly. Let's see why. Because we have build errors. Let's see our errors. Okay. Build errors are indicated by the stop sign. This red stop sign with a bug, with exclamation mark in it. It says view controller has no initializers. Type annotation missing in pattern. So we created variables, but we didn't give them a type, and we didn't really give them an initializer, or we didn't say what should the default value be, how should it be constructed. Okay, so for a button, the type for a button is UI button. Okay, for a label, the type is UI label. Let's see if this fixes it. And so I'm doing run, or rather I'm doing build, and then it'll build it and then suppress the errors till it completes. So it says view controller has no initializers. How did I get these UI button, UI label? Well, when I click on a button and then do the same thing, identity inspector, it shows me the class is UI button. When it's grayed out, that means it's the default. Like I didn't override it with a custom button class. Same thing for label. When I click on it, the class is label. Sometimes if you navigate over these as well, they'll show you, but it's not doing that for me right now. Okay, so we have a UI button and a UI label. How do I fix this no initializers? So this is kind of jumping ahead, but Apple has a concept called an optional for Swift, where an optional is a variable that doesn't get initialized till later. If we were doing an int, like let's comment out these variables. Let's do a variable that's an int. If we did an int called myInt, its class, the thing that's after the colon, would be int. And then the variable, or rather the value I set up with is 0. If I did this, it would compile correctly. Let's just wait for it. It compiles correctly because when you create a variable, just a straight variable, it wants to know what value it should be set with, or rather initialized, or constructed, or created with. That's what those all mean. Initialized, constructed. It's what it's created with. If I remove that equals 0, then we'll get our build error once again. See? No initializers. So how do I resolve it? So I added equals 0, I set a value. That works for ints, but it doesn't work for buttons. because the button comes from an interface, like interface builder. It gets set up by interface builder. So the way I do that, first I'll uncomment these. Commenting out, if you add 2 forward slashes, that prevents your code from running. And then deleting them uncomments it. There's also one of these lets you comment out. There we go. In structure comment selection, they'll actually let you comment out a single line. In editor, structure, and toggling it will do uncomment. This is a fast way to comment or uncomment several lines of code. But the general idea is commenting prevents code from running. Okay, so I'll uncomment out my button and my label. To make this compile, I create them as an optional. I say this is a variable that'll get set later. I'm not going to do an =0 or equals button with type and name because I'm letting interface builder do that. So our compilation errors are resolved. Okay, so if I look at the code again, everything compiles, right? No build errors. But I want to see if it's connected. So how do I check that? So I'll click on the view controller. Then, like I said, if I set everything up correctly and click on the connections inspector, it'll kind of mirror my class. So I just navigated between different views in here. But the class is set correctly. Then when I click in here, the properties, if I did it correctly, button and label will show up. I didn't. Because when you're working with interface builder, you need to add a keyword called IB outlet that says these items are available as an outlet to interface builder. The reason for that is, like, if you look at like, we don't need, if it's like a housekeeping thing, we don't need it to be available to interface builder. But if it's a UI thing that we want to modify on the UI directly, we need to say IB outlet. So the way we do that is in front of var, we add @IB outlet. And then if we compile it by doing Control B, or rather Command B, it's compile fine. Compiles. Okay, now let's see if we can find it. Okay. So we see up here, my button and my label show up. How do we connect them? This is my favorite part. So you can click on the radio button, it'll turn to a plus sign, and then drag and drop onto the element. You want to drag, it'll only let you drag and drop on the correct corresponding class. So for button, I can only drag and drop on other buttons. So we'll do that, and then you'll see here my button is connected to my button. The code and view controller for that guy is now hooked up to the layout for this guy. And then I'll do the same thing for the label. Now let's see it in action. So, if I run it, nothing will happen because I'm not modifying the code. But let's just check to make sure it still runs. Okay. Nothing happens, but it didn't break anything. So, what I want to do now is, when the app launches, I want to change the text. So, I'm going to say the text for the button is now equal to I've launched. So strings in Swift, you just put the contents, like all the text, in double quotes. Okay, so I have launched. And then to assign it to the button, we say my button question mark dot text is equal to I have launched. And then now let's try to run. Or rather, let's try to build and see what happens. Okay, it says UI button has no member text. Okay, so I need to use some other property to set the text. What is this question mark? So when you create a variable that's an optional, optionals are kind of like, you say, I have something that's going to be set at runtime, but also at runtime, it's kind of a built-in check. Like if it doesn't exist, do nothing. So what I'm going to do is my button question mark is look up this my button variable, and if it exists using that question mark, then perform an operation on something on it. So I'll say if it exists, then let's change the text attribute. Button doesn't have an attribute called text though, so we need to find the correct one. So let's try again. So we'll say my button dot, and then let's just start typing. So Xcode has autocomplete. So the one that we want to use is title label. And then if we look here, I'll show you the name of the property, but also the type. So title label is another label, but it's also another optional. So we'll say title label, and then as an optional, we have to do the question mark again. Then here, if we do autocomplete, we can do text. So you can start typing, and then you can click on the up or down arrows to select one, and once you've picked it, select it. Now here we can say text equals I have launched. Okay. One last thing. So you know how we're doing autocomplete and we have to add the question mark when we're using a property that's an optional, like if we're setting something. Now if we're setting a value directly, like on here text, I use the question mark to kind of access whatever's in here. Like if I was reading the text out, I would use the question mark, or if I need to modify a subproperty. But when you're just setting the value, you don't need to use it. You just set it using the equal sign. So here's our code. When the app launches, when it does view did load, set the title labels text to I have launched. So let's see if that works. So a lot of times what I'll do is I'll kill the simulator and bring it back if I'm not sure if it launched correctly. And so that's what I just did there. And so I'm running it again. I have launched. So when the simulator fires up, sometimes it'll pop up for you, sometimes it won't. When it pops up, if our code executed correctly, it'll change the text from this is a label to I have launched, because this did load executes after this guy, after the interface builder loads our UI. So let's see if it's running. It's still loading. We have a white screen. This is a label and it did not launch. So we have to figure out why it didn't launch. So this is debugging time. Okay. So the first thing we want to debug for is, did this piece of code get executed? The way we do that is with a breakpoint. With a breakpoint, you click right next to the line you want, and then when you do, it'll make this little blue tag. What happens then is when you try to run the code, it'll stop at that line of code. So let's see what happens now. Okay, it executed the line of code. Now, why didn't anything change? Well, okay, so the code got there, but that means I did something wrong. Remember, what was I trying to do? I was trying to change the label from this is a label to I have launched. What did I end up typing? My button. So instead of changing the text in the label, I tried to change the text in the button, and I called the wrong property. So I was trying to change the wrong property on the wrong object. So let's go back and let's see what I should have done correctly. So click me. That's our button, my button. Let's see what the property is for the title. It's title. With buttons, there's a title label But the better way to change stuff on a button is using this method called set title for control state. That's how you like specify what text shows up when the button is inactive or when it's active. So if I want to say make the button say I have launched, I'll say set title I have launched for control state. Then with these, if you click on it, this is kind of a hint for what the type should be. So when you start doing your autocomplete, it'll tell you the type. When you do for like this, the type is control state, but it's a state. It's an enumerated variable, so we have to have a value on there. So I'm going to say normal. So UI control state dot normal. And sometimes you'll need to retype it because sometimes it breaks. Like autocomplete may work the first time, then break the second time. Like if you keep changing your mind when you're writing the code. So let's see if that changes the text on the button first, and then let's make it change it for the label. So our breakpoint still executes. And then let's see what happens. So you see this? The text now says I have launched. Cool. So let's make the button work. Let's make the label work. Let's change it back. So how would I do it for the label? So now I want to say my label instead of my button dot text equals I have launched. And this is what I should have done the first time, but it's good I didn't because it gave us an opportunity to learn how to fix an error. And that's what you'll be doing in your code a lot of times. You'll be writing code, trying to find the right property, doing a breakpoint, and using that breakpoint as a jumping off point to debug. So let's see what happens now when I run. Cool, I have launched. Good, good, good. So let's do one final thing before wrapping up. I want to make it so that when they click on the button, we'll change whatever is in the label. So a good way to do that is, let's use this count. This myInt variable we created. Let's use it to have like a button press count or something. What we'll do now is when they click on the button, instead of saying I have launched, it'll change it to whatever the count is. So you guys remember the way you do something in Swift, or if you don't know, is using a function. A function is a block of code that executes. And you start off with the keyword func. Okay. And so I'm going to call it, you usually name a function like using a verb and a noun, like what it should do. So in this one we'll say change label text. Okay, so that's the name of the function, func change label text. Then inside of our parentheses we'll have our parameters, like if we're gonna use a variable or something from somewhere else to change it, but we're not gonna do that now. And so we've written a function, a stub called func change label text, which will let us, or rather aims to change the text inside of a label. That way I don't have to do this code directly. So let's copy this code and move it. I'm gonna cut, so I'm gonna do Command X, and then I'm gonna paste it down here. You could also use the shortcuts Command X and Command V. Okay. So how do I call the function? So to call a function, you call the function name, and you cannot use autocomplete, including the parentheses. So now instead of doing that piece of code that changes a line of text directly inside of our futed load function, I'll call the method. Okay. And let's see what happens. Okay, I have launched shows up there. So what I want to do is whenever they click on the button, I want to show the count. So I'm going to create a string that contains something from myInt. First, I'm going to change the name of my int to count. So I'll do that by just clicking on it up here, changing it to count. Now I need to make the string show that. So, how do I do that? Okay. So first, we'll change the text part of the string. So I'll say count, colon. Then we need to do something to kind of embed the variable inside of our string. And the way we do that, in Swift, to embed a variable's value in a string, you say / 2 parentheses, then inside those parentheses you'll have the name. You can use this to embed like another string in your string or an int. And there are some special rules you have to follow for types, like if you're doing a float, or if you want to limit like the number of zeros that show up. But this is our simple example. We're going to embed the value of count inside of our label. So let's build and run, and let's see if it works. Okay, so it works. It shows count is 0. Now, to make it interesting, what I want to do is every time I click on that button, I want to increase the count by 1. So, to do that, I say count is equal to count plus 1. Pretty easy. So how do I tie this function to our button? We know we could call the function from somewhere else, but how do I tie it to the button? Well, you would think that if I added properties, they would show up to Interface Builder. And, by clicking on this, then clicking in here. If I added methods, they should show up too, right? Yes and no. So first let's find out how to make that work. So methods will actually show up. They won't show up in the outlet list. Outlet is all the items you're connecting. They'll show up in the function list, and then the functions get triggered by an event. So these events, the way we view that is we'll click on the button and we'll see its events. These events correspond to how the user is interacting with the app, like touch down, touch up inside, touch up outside, value changed. For a button, the interaction we want is when the user has stopped clicking on the button. So basically, their finger has left the button. They touched down, then they touched up, and it's inside the button. So we're going to look for this event, touch up inside. And then to connect it, we'll try to drag onto the view controller. And if we did it correctly, something would show up. And you see here, nothing shows up. So we have to follow a similar process to what we did with the UI elements, adding IB outlet. To make a function show up, what we do is, before the func keyword, we add @IB action. And just like IB outlet makes a property discoverable by Interface Builder, IB action makes a function discoverable by Interface Builder. So if we click here now and do it, you see instead of being just a white screen, it'll be highlighted. Then there'll be a list, and this list says change label text. So now our function is registered to change the text. Okay. So let's save and run. Quick tip, you can always check if something is saved or not, because if it's saved, the icon is white. If it has unsaved changes, they're gray. Then you can manually save. This way you won't lose your changes. Okay. So now let's run and see what happens. Cool, so count is 0, let's click the button. So that count is 1, click it again, count is 2. How's this working? Well, let's check. So if I set a breakpoint here, what should happen is every time that event gets registered, this breakpoint will fire. See that? It is. Cool. So that's your first app. We made an app that launches something and then allows you to click on a button and change the text. You can do a whole lot of fun stuff with Interface Builder. This is just the start. Like, you can add text fields, sliders. I encourage you to play around. In my next video, I'm going to show you transitions, like how you go from one screen to another. Thank you for watching. I hope it helped. Goodbye.